In my right hand, I have the Rolex Submariner date, a 2021 model, and in my left, I have the Omega Seamaster 300M. This is the Clash of the Titans. Welcome back to the Chisholm Hunter channel. My name is Harrison and this is another versus video. Today we have the Rolex Submariner date, a 2021 edition, that's important to say, and the Omega Seamaster 300M. Obviously I have some personal ties with the Omega Seamaster 300M. I actually own one in white, but let's look at this subjectively. The Rolex in my right hand comes in at 41mm in diameter, whereas the Omega comes in at 42mm in diameter. As much as it pains me to say this, I prefer the 41, and the reason I prefer the 41 is because I have slightly slimmer wrists, and smaller watches just suit me that little bit more. It's a personal preference, but I'd say the Rolex. Let's get the digital calipers out and let's measure the thickness and the lug to lug. So the thickness of the Omega comes in at 14mm. The Rolex, however, in my left hand at the moment, comes in at 13.6 at a push, so it is that slight bit thinner than the Submariner, and you can feel this when it's on the wrist. It's actually something that Drew and I picked up on straight away. It's surprisingly thin, and it feels great. It feels heavy, but I suppose that's partly why it's got the bracelet. It feels that little bit heavier, but we'll save that for later. The lug to lug of the Omega Seamaster comes in at 49mm, just touching 50mm maybe, but the lug to lug of the Rolex is an interesting one. The lug to lug of the Rolex comes in at 45mm, maybe just touching 46mm, so it is that little bit smaller. The lugs are less elongated. The Rolex lugs are slightly stubbier than the Omegas. The Omegas are more elongated and classy, shall we say. I'm actually in two minds here. I do like a more compact watch, but I quite like the style of the Omega's lugs and how that rubber strap fits perfectly in between them without leaving a gap. Both of these watches come in stainless steel, and for those of you that know me, you'll know that I pick stainless steel watches. I just prefer the metal. I think it's that little bit more vibrant than titanium or even some of the golds, and it pops that face out that little bit more. But then we get to the bracelet or the rubber strap. The Omega in my left hand obviously has the rubber strap option, whereas when you're buying the Rolex Submariner new, it doesn't have the rubber strap option. I prefer the rubber strap on the Omega. That's why I have my own Omega at home that has the rubber strap. I think it's that little bit more versatile. But I do prefer the Rolex bracelet to the Omega's bracelet. It's just a personal preference, but I like that oyster bracelet and I like how it's brushed finished. So it's 1 point each. Let's talk about the crowns on both of these models. Both these models have very similar crowns. When we look at the Omega, the crown guards slope up more gradually than the Rolex. The Rolex has a more increased slope up, if that makes any sense. And the crown on the Omega is a little bit smaller than the crown on the Rolex. To be honest, I prefer the more subtle design of the Omega's crown. It's just personal preference, but I think it fits this watch really, really nicely. Both of these watches have ceramic bezels in a glossy black color, and both of them are absolutely stunning. But the deciding factor is the teeth of the bezels. In my left hand, the Omega has a cross between raised and lowered platforms on the bezel, giving it a nice texture and a nice pattern, and it's a really cool shape, but it's more for style. If you think about it from a diver's point of view, when they have very thick gloves on, they need thick, prominent teeth in order to turn the bezel. So although I like the style of the Omega, let's get onto the Rolex. The Rolex has that more prominent feel. It has more prominent teeth, and it is, with a thick wetsuit on, that much easier to turn. So I suppose it's what you want to go for. I obviously have an Omega, I picked style. But the Rolex probably wins in terms of functionality here because of the use of this watch, or what it should be used for. Then we get to the watch lover's dream. Then we get to the sound of the actual bezel clicks and how it feels when you turn it. So I'm going to put this right into the mic for you. That's subtle. That's clean. That's really clean. Actually, we'll take a look at the Omega, but I think there's a winner here. Then we get to the Omega, and the clicks sound prominent, but they're not as prominent as the Rolex. Take a listen. It's still satisfying, it's still a brilliant feel, and it's very, very durable, and you can feel the quality in it. But for some reason, I'm siding with Rolex here. The text on the Rolex's bezel is that little bit smaller, but it almost looks a little bit thicker than the Omega's writing on the bezel. Both are extremely clean to read and easy to read. It's not like one's better than the other here. I'm actually struggling telling which one I would go for. I actually quite like the design of the dots all the way around the Omega's bezel. So from a design perspective, I'd probably look at Omega. Being a fully functional diver, both of these watches have that little dot of Loom on the bezel. One, however, outweighs the other one, in my personal opinion. But before we get onto that, let's have a wrist check. At the moment, I'm currently wearing the Omega Speedmaster, the chronograph with the Hess-like crystal. It's a fantastic watch. I've been able to wear it today, thankfully, and it's incredible. What's on your wrist? Also, while you're writing that comment, who wins this battle? This clash of the titans, is it the Rolex or Omega? Let me know below. The Rolex's dot of superluminova on that bezel is bigger than the Omega's. The Omega's is a lot smaller with an outline of a triangle above it pointing at that 12 o'clock mark, whereas the Rolex's is filled in white and the little dot is bigger. And I suppose I would probably side with the one that has more superluminova, just because you're getting more of that material, but functionality wise, you're more likely to hit and damage the superluminova on the bezel of this than you are the Omega. So do you want style or functionality? Let's get into the dial of both of these watches. As you can see, I'm quite excited about talking about the dials because I think my watch wins. This is just my personal preference, but the Omega, with that wave motif running through it, it adds that extra layer of depth. This obviously is the black dial. I'm not going to talk about colors because you can kind of get a lot of different color variations. The Rolex has a plain black dial. I say plain, but when it's as plain as the Rolex and as simple as the Rolex, it has a classiness to it. It has a cleanness to it. So I can understand why people go for the Rolex. But being a photographer, being a videographer, having a love for art, I do love that wave motif. Both of these models, of course, have Loom. And before we go any further, before we forget, let's show you that Loom. This is the Rolex's Loom, and it's a bright, bright blue color. It's fading off a little bit now, but I'm really impressed. This is the Omega's Loom, and in my eyes, it's that little bit brighter. I do prefer this purely because it has a combination of blue and green. That is both of the Looms, and I do prefer the Omega's Loom. This isn't me being biased because I have an Omega. I just like the fact that it has a combination of green and blue. It looks brilliant to me, but let's get back to Rolex's classiness, their cleanness. I do know why they've done it this way. So it depends. Do you want to draw the eye with the Omega, or do you want to remain discreet and have something a little bit more understated? Before we move any further, we have a giveaway. We are giving away 5 Breguet hats. All you need to do is subscribe below and comment with your favorite Breguet model. They're actually really high quality. I tried to steal one, and the company wouldn't allow me to steal one, which is a shame. But anyway, on with the video. Let's dive deeper into the dial. So on the Omega, on the hands, they are skeletonized, and on the Rolex, they are not skeletonized. They're slender, they're elegant. I chose an Omega, and I chose it for a reason, and the reason that I chose it is partially for those skeletonized hands. It's a personal preference, but I like the fact you can see through to the dial through those hands. So I do like the Omega, but if you want to be that little more classy and that little more subtle, again, I would go with the Rolex. Another little detail that I like about the Omega is the splash of red on that dial. It has a splash of red on the tip of the second hand, and also a little bit of red. The Seamaster logo is in red, whereas there's no red or no color on the Rolex. Now, it goes back to that debate again. Do you like cleanness, or do you like something that little bit more stylized that is going to draw the eye? In a lot of ways, I love how subtle the Rolex is, but in a lot of ways, I love how stylized and how fun the Omega is. Let's talk about the date window for a second on both of these models. And on this channel, Drew and I have always strived to give honest reviews. If we don't like something as much, we will tell you. If we like something or love something, I will clearly tell you. I get very excited about it. So let's talk about these date windows. On the Rolex, the date window is at 3 o'clock, and it has a Cyclops eye. That is the magnification window. The nickname that we give it is a Cyclops eye. On the Omega, it doesn't have a Cyclops eye, and it's at 6 o'clock. Seeing these two watches in person, I would have to side with the Omega. I prefer the symmetry that Omega gives with that 6 o'clock date window, and to be honest, I prefer that it's that little bit smaller. But on that note, when you think traditionally, when you think through the ages of Rolex, of Omega, of every watch brand in the industry, they normally have a 3 o'clock date window. So it kind of fits in to that classical theme. This is a weird thing to say, but I love how discreet Rolex is. It seems to pull inspiration without totally changing its identity. Moving on to the indices. The indices on each of these are actually extremely similar. They are a combination of circles and rectangles, although on the Rolex it has a triangle at the top. I honestly couldn't pick between the two. I think they're just too similar. Let's move on to the logos. The logos of both are at the 12 o'clock mark, and I suppose it's what you prefer. Do you like that Rolex crown, or do you like the Omega symbol? I honestly love both, so I couldn't pick. Before we go any further, let's talk about Chisholm Hunter. Chisholm Hunter are actually authorized retailers for Omega watches and pre-owned retailers for Rolex. You can find every single watch in the world. I say in the world because we have such a wide selection in the link below. Before we move on to the movement, it's important to say that being diving watches, both of these models are water resistant to 300 meters, so there's not really a comparison there. Both of them have screw down crowns. So let's flip these watches round and see what lies in the underbelly. Starting with the Omega, it actually has an open case back so that you can see in to that beautiful beating heart. The movement in the Omega is the Omega Caliber 8800. It's a self-winding movement with a coaxial escapement. It's certified by Master Chronometer and approved by Metas. It's resistant to magnetic fields reaching up to 15,000 Gauss. It has a free sprung balance with silicone balance spring. It's fully automatic, winding in both directions, and it has a power reserve of 55 hours. And give me a second, I need to take a breath. I do apologize if I go through that quite fast. I think that other people have said to me on the channel that the Scottish accent does tend to come through when I get a bit more excited. And when I talk about watch brands like Rolex and Omega, I do, being a watch nerd, get that little bit more excited. Moving on to the movement of the Rolex, and oh, that bracelet just feels amazing. Moving on to the movement of the Rolex, and before we do, I would really, really appreciate it if you could hit this subscribe button. It's not actually going to be here, it's going to be probably down there, but I'd really appreciate it. The movement in this model is of course fully automatic, just like the Omega. The movement in this model is the Caliber Rolex 3235. It's accurate to -2 + 2 seconds per day. The oscillator in this movement has a paramagnetic blue parachrome hairspring. That was a mouthful. It has high performance Paraflex Rolex shock absorbers. It has a bidirectional self-winding movement, or rotor rather, and a power reserve of 70 hours. When it comes to the movements, both are fantastic. I have to say, I do like the fact I can see through to the movement in the Omega, but it doesn't devalue the Rolex at all. It's just a style trait. And when you think back to the classic approach, brands through the generations, watches through the generations, most of them did have closed case backs. It's actually quite a recent thing to open the case back, so I can understand why Rolex did this. But then we get to the power reserve, and the Rolex has 70 hours, whereas the Omega only has 55. So statistically, the Rolex wins that. But then you look at the COSC and Metas certification of the Omega, and only the COSC of the Rolex. Plus, you can see through to the Omega. I choose Omega. The Omega comes in at £4,550, so there is a big price gap there, especially when you think about the waiting lists for a Rolex. And if you want to pick it up in the secondary market, you'll be paying a lot of money, and my price budget is just out with it. I can't afford a Rolex at the moment. I've always aspired to buy a Rolex. I love the Rolex brand, but I just can't stretch that far at the moment. I am going to be very honest with you both. I feel like I'm talking to Drew. I'm going to be very honest with all of you. I think the Rolex is a fantastic watch. I think that it's rare, it's classic, it's always going to be a Rolex, it's always going to be beautifully made. I just like how different the Seamaster is. I like that splash of red, I like the wave motif in the dial, I like the fact you can see through to the movement. There's lots of things I really love and connect with on a personal level with the Omega. And on that personal note, with my watch collection, if you've seen the video, if you've not, I'll plug it up here, but I do tend to go for watches that are off the beaten path. They're a little bit different. Let's look at the Grand Seiko American Exclusive for an example. The watches that I go for are not for everybody. And I feel like it's kind of like me. I'm a bit of a weirdo, I'm not for everyone, and that's why I kind of connect with these watches. So I'm gonna have to say, I'd side with the Omega. With that said, I have to also say, I've always aspired to buy a Rolex. I genuinely have. I really want the Rolex Daytona with the white dial and the steel bezel, just a personal thing. I love that watch. It's actually one of the first watches that I saw when I came in the industry. And it's funny, watches kind of mark a special moment and a special occasion in people's lives. I have a really personal connection with my Omega, and for that next special moment, for that next special occasion, I would like it to be a Rolex. Thank you very much for stopping by on the Chisholm Hunter channel and watching this Versus video. My name is Harrison. As always, I've had far too much coffee today, you could probably tell. If you agree with my decision, make sure you hit this subscribe button. If you don't agree, make sure you hit this subscribe button. And I'll see you next time.